She was branded a criminal, a fearless public defender framed with drugs on a stormy night, betrayed by the very system she swore to fight for. The streets cheered for their hero captain, but behind the badge was corruption, lies, and ruin. No one believed her, except him. Atlas, a scarred German shepherd with eyes that had seen too much, became her only witness, her only shield. What followed will shake your faith in justice and prove that even in the darkest storm, loyalty can light the way. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe truth always finds a way, and that every soul, human or animal, deserves a second chance, hit that subscribe button. This story will stay with you forever. Harbor Point, Maine, was a coastal town that always smelled faintly of brine and diesel, a place where gulls screamed overhead and the wind never seemed to rest. That night, however, the usual rhythm of the waves against the pier was drowned out by a torrential storm that battered the town with sheets of rain, slapping against clapboard houses, rusted lobster traps, and the cracked pavement of the narrow streets. Lightning flickered over the black Atlantic, briefly illuminating the crooked outline of the lighthouse, and the thunder rolled across the water like the echo of old cannons. It was close to midnight, and the storm had swallowed Harbor Point whole. The only moving vehicle along Dockside Road was an old silver sedan, its windshield wipers slashing frantically at the downpour. Inside the car sat Grace Whitaker, 35 years old, a public defender with eyes the color of dark coffee and hair pulled back into a damp bun that had long since loosened. Her face was pale from exhaustion, her cheekbones sharper than they had been a few years ago when she first started working cases, but her expression carried the hard edges of someone who had grown used to fighting uphill battles. Grace had the posture of someone constantly bracing herself for impact, shoulders squared even in solitude, hands gripping the wheel tight enough that her knuckles whitened. She had grown up in Harbor Point, daughter of a fisherman-turned-union activist, and although she had the option to leave for bigger courts in Boston, she had stayed because she believed the poor, the voiceless, the forgotten, deserved someone to stand between them and the system that too often chewed them up. But the system was wearing her down. Every case she took was another scar, another sleepless night. Beside her in the passenger seat, curled against the worn fabric, was Atlas, a 9-year-old German shepherd with a coat of black and tan that had dulled with age. He was leaner than most, ribs faintly visible beneath his fur, and bore a faint scar along his right flank from a fight years earlier with a stray dog in the shipyard. One of his ears, the left, bent slightly at the tip, giving him a lopsided appearance, but his amber eyes were sharp and intelligent, always watching, always guarding. Atlas had been with Grace since her second year as a defender, when a client, a homeless veteran, had passed away unexpectedly. The veteran's only possession of value was the dog he had trained, a loyal companion named after the titan who held up the world. "He carries the weight so you don't have to," the veteran had once said, patting the dog's head with pride. Grace had promised to look after him, and though Atlas could never explain it, he seemed to understand that he was continuing the mission his first master had given him, to carry burdens, to shoulder weight, to protect. Over time, Atlas became Grace's constant shadow, her confidant on long nights driving home from the courthouse, her guardian when threats came from angry clients or vengeful officers. His name was not just a name, it was a reminder of what it meant to keep standing, even when the world was heavier than one person could bear. Grace whispered it sometimes when she was afraid. "Atlas, hold the line with me." He always did. Tonight, Atlas shifted uneasily, sensing the tension that hung heavier than the rain. His hackles rose each time a shadow flickered through the storm, each time a distant siren howled. Grace reached over and rubbed his ear absently. "Almost home, boy," she murmured. But home was still a few miles away. At that moment, blue and red lights suddenly exploded in her rearview mirror, blinding through the rain-streaked glass. Her stomach tightened. She checked the speedometer. She was under the limit. She had her seatbelt on. Nothing was wrong. Yet the patrol car stayed behind her, close enough that she could feel its pressure. With a sigh, she flicked on her signal and pulled over by the curb near the empty pier. Water pooled along the edge of the road, reflecting the distorted carnival of police lights. She rolled down her window as a figure approached, rain dripping off the brim of his hat. Captain Cole Maddox was a man who carried himself like the town belonged to him. At 48, with a square jaw dusted by gray stubble and hair flecked silver at the temples. He looked every inch the image of a decorated officer. His uniform was pristine even in the downpour, creases sharp, badge polished. To the public, he was the savior of Harbor Point, the captain who had cleaned up the streets, who posed for photographs with schoolchildren, who shook hands with councilmen at parades. But those who had seen his eyes up close knew there was steel and calculation behind the charm, and perhaps something darker. Grace had crossed him before, challenging his arrests, pointing out inconsistencies, demanding body cam footage that never appeared. His thin smile in court had always seemed like a warning. Now, under the storm, that smile appeared again. "Evening, Miss Whitaker," Maddox said smoothly, his voice carrying through the rain. "Tail lights out. Dangerous in weather like this." Grace blinked. "That's not possible. I checked them just this morning." He leaned closer, flashlight beam sliding across her face, then across Atlas. The shepherd growled low, teeth bared, and Maddox's smile tightened. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Grace hesitated. "Am I being detained?" Maddox tilted his head, mock patience in his expression. "Routine stop. You understand procedure." Behind him, another silhouette emerged from the storm. Officer Kyle Dent, mid-30s, stocky with a buzz cut and a nervous twitch in his jaw, circled toward the back of her sedan. Dent was known among defense lawyers for being Maddox's shadow, loyal to a fault, his reports always conveniently matching his captain's. His uniform was less tidy, his boots scuffed, but his eyes darted with the restlessness of someone always looking over his shoulder. Atlas's growl deepened, ears pinned back, his gaze fixed on Dent through the rain-specked glass of the side mirror. Grace's heart hammered. Something was wrong. Maddox kept his hand casually resting on his holster as he gestured again. "Out of the car, Miss Whitaker, unless you've got something to hide." Reluctantly, Grace unbuckled and stepped into the storm. Rain immediately plastered her blazer to her skin, cold rivulets running down her collar. Maddox moved to block her view as Dent crouched by the trunk. Through the blur of rain, Grace glimpsed him slipping a gloved hand inside his jacket, pulling something small, wrapped in plastic. Her breath caught. She tried to step forward, but Maddox raised a hand. "Stay where you are." The trunk latch popped. Dent leaned in, his body shielding the movement, and tucked the package beneath the floor mat. Seconds later, he straightened. "Captain," he called, pitching his voice for effect, "you might want to see this." Maddox strode over, then turned with a solemn expression, holding up a sealed bag of white powder. His voice was cold, almost triumphant. 3 kilos of cocaine. Care to explain, counselor?" Grace felt the world tilt. "That's not mine. You know damn well it's not mine." Maddox's smirk widened, just enough to show he had anticipated this reaction. With a nod, Dent stepped forward, steel cuffs in his hands. The click of metal around her wrists was louder than thunder. Atlas erupted in the car, barking and snarling, hurling himself against the window as if he could break through. The storm roared. Harbor Point swallowed in its fury as Grace Whitaker was dragged toward the patrol car, her dog's desperate growls the only protest against the betrayal. Morning broke over Harbor Point with a sky the color of tarnished steel, the storm having passed but leaving puddles in every gutter and a film of salt on every window pane. The town woke not to the sound of gulls or boat engines, but to headlines screaming across every phone screen and newspaper. Public defender arrested on drug charges. Grace Whitaker's name, once spoken with respect by clients and colleagues, was now being whispered in bars and fish markets with disbelief or smug confirmation, depending on the company. In a town like Harbor Point, reputation traveled faster than the tide. For Grace, her world had collapsed overnight. She was processed swiftly. The efficiency of the machine she had spent years fighting against now turned against her. Fingerprints, mugshots, confiscation of personal effects. Her blazer and sensible flats were exchanged for an orange jumpsuit that hung loose around her frame, the fabric stiff and impersonal. Shackles rattled against the cement as she was led through the echoing corridors of the Millfield Detention Center, the facility where she had once met countless clients behind glass. Now she walked the other side, past guards who refused to meet her eyes. The cell assigned to her was cramped, the cinder-block walls painted in dull beige that peeled in the corners. A narrow cot with a thin mattress sagged under its own weight, the blanket scratchy and reeking faintly of bleach. A single barred window let in a square of pale light, illuminating dust motes that floated in the heavy air. Grace sat on the edge of the cot, wrists still sore from the cuffs, her body trembling with a mixture of rage and exhaustion. Across the cell, her roommate sat quietly, watching. Ruth Ann Carter was a woman in her late 40s with dark auburn hair streaked gray at the temples, pulled back into a frayed braid. Her face bore the lines of fatigue but also of resilience, cheekbones hollowed by stress yet softened by the warmth in her hazel eyes. Once a nurse at the town clinic, she had been known for her compassion toward patients who couldn't pay their bills, always sneaking them extra bandages or medication samples. But a year ago, she had been arrested in a case led by Maddox's team, caught with narcotics she swore had been planted in her car. Her license revoked, her career ruined, Ruth Ann carried herself with quiet dignity despite the stain on her name. When Grace entered, Ruth Ann offered a nod, not unkind, as though she had been expecting her. "Another one," she said softly, voice hoarse but steady. "Same trick, same hands pulling the strings." Grace lifted her head, her eyes narrowing. "You mean Maddox?" Ruth Ann leaned back against the wall, arms folded across her chest. "Who else? He's been doing this for years. I'm just one of many. You'd be surprised how many cells in here are filled by people who crossed him." The words cut through Grace's despair like a jagged knife. She had suspected corruption, even gathered threads of evidence, but hearing it confirmed by someone who had lived it made her stomach knot. She felt the weight of her father's ghost again, Thomas Whitaker, who had warned her before his own fall that Harbor Point's justice system was rotting from the inside. His warnings had sounded paranoid at the time. Now, they rang as truth. That evening, the cell block echoed with the metallic clang of doors shutting, guards making their rounds. Grace lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with what Ruth Ann had said. She couldn't let despair devour her. Somewhere beyond these walls, someone needed to fight back, but for the first time in years, she felt powerless. Meanwhile, Atlas languished across town in the kennel attached to the Harbor Point Police Department. The kennel was a makeshift structure, a converted storage shed with chain-link pens and damp straw scattered on the concrete. Atlas sat in the corner of his enclosure, his body tense, ears flicking at every sound. His amber eyes glowed in the dim light, reflecting a quiet fury. He had seen Grace dragged away, heard her cry out against injustice, and now he was separated from her by cold steel. The officer on duty, a young recruit named Terry Collins, barely out of his 20s with a narrow frame and a nervous laugh, tossed kibble into a metal dish and quickly retreated. Collins wasn't cruel, just inexperienced and eager to avoid trouble. He muttered to himself that the dog gave him chills. Atlas ignored the food. His gaze never left the latch of the gate. The latch was old, rust creeping along the hinge. The storm had swollen the wood around it, leaving it slightly loose. Atlas rose slowly, his muscles taut beneath his fur. He pressed his nose against the weak spot, testing it, then scraped with his paw. The metal groaned faintly. He tried again, claws hooking into the wire, tugging, scraping. Hours passed, the sound masked by the hum of rain still dripping from gutters. By midnight, Atlas had worried the latch enough that it shifted with a metallic snap. He pushed, and the gate swung open just enough for him to squeeze through. His body slipped into the shadows, paws silent against the damp earth. He paused only once, turning his head back toward the building where Grace remained locked away. His chest rose and fell in a silent vow. Then he trotted into the night, disappearing into the alleys of Harbor Point, a ghost with fur and fire in his eyes. Back inside the detention center, Grace whispered into the darkness of her cell. She thought no one was listening, but Ruth Ann stirred on her cot, awake. "You're not the first, Grace, but maybe you'll be the last if you can get out of this." Grace clenched her fists, whispering back, "Then I have to survive it first." June Whitaker had always been a fighter, though in ways that differed from her younger sister Grace. At 38, she carried herself with the practiced discipline of her years as a Navy nurse, her posture upright and steady even when exhaustion tugged at her shoulders. Her hair, once a sunlit blonde like Grace's, was cropped short and practical, streaked with pale threads that testified to long nights in combat hospitals overseas. June's hands bore faint scars from fieldwork burn marks from sterilizing instruments, thin white lines from shattered glass and hurried evacuations. Her hazel eyes, sharp yet kind, were the sort that had calmed wounded soldiers in the worst of chaos. Life after the Navy had been quieter, working part-time at a local clinic, but she retained the readiness of someone who never entirely stopped scanning exits and listening for alarms. When she saw the headlines that morning, her sister's mugshot plastered beside the words "drug trafficking arrest," her stomach had hardened into stone. She knew Grace, knew her moral spine too well to believe such a thing. It was not just denial, it was certainty. If the world branded Grace guilty, then June would become her shield. She started by reaching out to someone she hadn't spoken to in years, Marion Hale, a former FBI special agent. Marion was 51, tall and rangy, with long limbs that made her look almost predatory when she moved. Her hair, a deep black streaked silver, was worn in a blunt cut to her shoulders, framing a face with angular cheekbones and perpetually narrowed eyes. She had been known inside the Bureau for her relentlessness in corruption cases, a quality that had made her both respected and quietly feared. Yet, 5 years ago, she had walked away after a sting operation had been sabotaged by someone inside the Bureau itself. That betrayal had left her distrustful of institutions, wary of alliances, and she now lived in semi-retirement on the outskirts of Portland, teaching self-defense classes to women at a community center. Still, Marion's fire hadn't dimmed. It smoldered, waiting for the right spark. When June appeared at her door, soaked from the drizzle, Marion raised an eyebrow but didn't turn her away. "You wouldn't be here if this wasn't about Grace," she said flatly, leading June into a cluttered living room lined with books on criminal psychology and half-packed boxes. June told her everything: the storm, Maddox, the planted drugs, the headlines. Marion listened, arms folded, her face unreadable until she finally muttered, "Maddox, I've heard the name. Too many complaints buried too fast. He smells like rot." She leaned forward. "But if you want to go after him, you'll need more than outrage. You'll need evidence that can't be burned." For that, June had already thought of someone else. Ethan Park was only 27, a wiry man with close-cropped black hair and a wardrobe of hoodies and worn sneakers. His thin framed glasses slid constantly down his nose as he hunched over screens, fingers flying with the restless energy of someone who couldn't sit still unless he was cracking firewalls. Ethan had grown up in Harbor Point as the son of Korean immigrants who ran a small grocery store. He had once been a promising student of computer engineering but had dropped out after a dispute with the university over tuition hikes. Since then, he had built a quiet reputation in town as the person to see if your laptop crashed or your network got hacked. Beneath his easy sarcasm lay a mind that had been shaped by seeing his parents harassed by local officials for zoning violations while larger businesses skated by untouched. Ethan had little love for authority, and when June asked for help, he smirked and said, "Taking down Maddox? Yeah, I'll skip Netflix for that." Together, the three formed a plan. Marion would teach them how to structure an investigation, what evidence would stand up, what would collapse in court. Ethan would dig into digital traces, surveillance cameras, police records, any servers sloppy enough to leave a door open. June would use her clinic contacts and her Navy resourcefulness to gather whispers from the community. They would move quietly, like shadows, because Maddox had eyes everywhere. That evening, June sat alone in her small seaside house, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The sound of the surf outside her window was interrupted by a sudden sharp barking. She startled, then recognized it instantly. Atlas. She rushed outside, slippers splashing in puddles, and there he was, muddy, fur-damp, chest-heaving, his amber eyes alight with urgency. He barked again, tail rigid, then ran a few steps down the road before turning back to her, insistent. June's throat tightened. "Atlas? You got out?" She crouched, stroking his wet fur, feeling the tremor of his muscles. He whined, then barked toward the pier, paws dancing impatiently. "Show me," she whispered. She grabbed her coat, and together they followed. Atlas led her through the darkened streets, past shuttered shops and lampposts still buzzing with rainwater. His nose skimmed the ground, guiding them with a purpose that seemed more human than canine. Finally, they reached the far edge of the harbor where the smell of salt and rust grew thick. There, rising like a broken tooth against the night sky, stood a warehouse with its sign faded almost to nothing. Warehouse 14. The building looked abandoned, boards loose on the windows, paint peeling, but Atlas stiffened, hackles raised, growling low in his throat. June squinted and saw a faint light flicker inside, then vanish. Her pulse quickened. This was no ordinary warehouse. Something lived there, hidden under the cover of salt-stained wood and darkness. She crouched beside Atlas, whispering, "Good boy, you found it." The dog pressed against her leg, steady and fierce, as if to remind her that Grace was not alone. For the first time since the arrest, June felt a sliver of hope. The harbor was quieter than the storm-tossed night before, but the smell of brine lingered, sharp and metallic, carried inland on the damp wind. The creak of ropes against moorings and the slap of waves against pilings echoed through the stillness. Atlas crouched low beside June, his amber eyes glinting in the shadows, every muscle quivering with suppressed energy. His ears twitched at the faint scrape of boots across concrete, and then his body stiffened. From the darkness emerged Officer Kyle Dent, his frame hunched against the drizzle, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. June held her breath, signaling to Marion Hale beside her. Marion had dressed for shadows, black coat blending with the night, hair tucked under a wool cap. Her face was taut with focus, her long fingers steady on the small camera she held. She leaned forward, angling for a clear shot as Dent slipped inside the warped door of Warehouse 14. From their vantage point, June and Marion caught sight of the scene inside through a gap in the boards. The light of a single hanging bulb illuminated the warehouse floor, where a group of officers waited. The air inside shimmered faintly with dust and salt, the smell of brine drifting even to where June crouched. One officer placed a stack of envelopes on a crate. Dent set the duffel down, unzipped it, revealing sealed packets inside. The exchange was methodical, casual, as though it had been rehearsed countless times. June felt her stomach knot. She had seen shady dealings during her years stationed abroad, but watching policemen who swore to protect trading contraband under the cover of a seafront warehouse was different. This was her sister's life, her town's rot, laid bare. Marion whispered, "Get this angle. Every handoff, every face." Her voice was quiet steel. She adjusted the zoom, capturing Dent's nervous glance over his shoulder. Meanwhile, Ethan Park sat in his cluttered apartment across town, monitors casting his face in blue light. His hoodie sleeves were rolled back, fingers flying over the keyboard. A half-eaten bowl of instant noodles sat forgotten beside him. Ethan's brow furrowed as he fought with corrupted files from Grace's impounded sedan. The dashcam data had been scrubbed by someone who thought themselves clever, but Ethan was cleverer. He muttered under his breath, "Come on, give me something." Finally, a corrupted frame blossomed into clarity, a rain-soaked night, the blurry shape of Dent leaning down toward the trunk. Ethan froze the image, enhanced it, and grinned. "Got you, you son of a..." He hit save and began compiling the recovered footage, each frame another nail in Maddox's coffin. Back at the harbor, Atlas gave a low growl, startling June. She placed a calming hand on his flank, but her eyes followed his gaze. Dent was not alone. Another man had appeared, tall and wiry, with pale hair plastered by the drizzle. June didn't recognize him, but Marion muttered, "That's Lieutenant Harris. Been with Maddox for over a decade. His name pops up in a lot of buried complaints." Harris moved with the authority of someone comfortable in corruption, flipping through the envelopes before pocketing one. He laughed with Dent, the sound harsh in the salt-heavy air. Just as June adjusted for a better look, a voice whispered behind them, startling her. "You're not the only ones watching." June spun, her hand instinctively tightening on the flashlight at her belt. In the dim glow, she saw Maggie Doyle, a widow in her 70s who tended the lighthouse at the harbor's edge. Maggie was a small, wiry woman with hair like weathered rope and skin tanned from years of salt spray. She wore a heavy cardigan, frayed at the cuffs, and her hands trembled slightly with age. But her eyes were clear, piercing blue, reflecting the steady resilience of someone who had lived through storms far worse than this. June exhaled in relief. "Maggie, you scared me half to death." Maggie gave a faint, humorless smile. "I've lived by this water for 40 years. Nothing surprises me anymore. And I've seen them, night after night. Boats docking when they shouldn't, men unloading crates, always ending up at that warehouse. I thought I was going mad until now." Marion leaned closer, her gaze sharp. "Why didn't you report it?" Maggie's face hardened. "Report it to who? Maddox's men? They'd have laughed and left me to rot. No, I keep my eyes open and my mouth shut. But if Grace is being chewed up by the same machine, maybe it's time I spoke." Her words carried the weight of years, years of silence, years of watching shadows move across the water with no one to hold accountable. June reached out, squeezing her hand. "You're not alone anymore." Inside the warehouse, the officer's laughter grew louder, Dent zipped the duffel closed, the envelopes now gone. Harris clapped him on the back, and the two disappeared deeper into the building. Marion lowered the camera, her jaw set. "That's enough for tonight. We've got them on film. And with Ethan's dash cam, we can start building a chain." June nodded, pulling Atlas close as they retreated into the fog. Maggie followed, slower, leaning on her cane but steady. The lighthouse beacon swept across the waves, casting long beams of light that seemed to cut through the corruption itself. Back in her apartment, Ethan uploaded the recovered footage, replaying the moment over and over. Dent's face illuminated by lightning as he planted the bag. Ethan shook his head, muttering, "You picked the wrong family to screw with." He sent the file to June with a single message. Proof in hand. Next step? That night, June sat at her kitchen table with Marion and Maggie. Atlas lay at their feet, head on his paws, eyes still alert. The smell of salt and damp wood clung to their clothes, a reminder of what they had witnessed. June spread the recovered dashcam stills across the table, next to Marion's camera files, and Maggie's handwritten notes of every boat she had seen over the past 6 months. For the first time, they had threads that connected. For the first time, they had more than whispers. And though the walls around Grace were thick and cold, out here, her allies were beginning to weave the rope that could pull her free. At dawn, the courthouse smelled of stale coffee and damp paper, the corridors lined with clerks shuffling files as though nothing unusual was happening. Yet beneath the monotony, a quiet urgency pulsed. Captain Cole Maddox had been at the courthouse since before sunrise, his uniform crisp, his jaw freshly shaved, projecting the kind of discipline that disguised his rot. He stood before Judge Evelyn Caldwell, a woman in her late 50s with tightly curled silver hair and glasses perched low on her nose. Judge Caldwell was known for her no-nonsense demeanor and an unwavering belief in order, a trait Maddox often exploited. She was meticulous about punctuality, her gavel striking down interruptions with the same precision she applied to her morning tea ritual. Maddox, with a veneer of calm authority, pressed his case. Grace Whitaker was a high-risk defendant with connections, a woman who might incite unrest. He insisted she be transferred to state custody immediately. Grace sat in shackles at the defense table, her orange jumpsuit glaring against her pale skin. Her lips were cracked from sleepless nights, but her eyes, though tired, still burned with defiance. She understood the weight of Maddox's words. A transfer meant vanishing into the labyrinth of the state prison system, far from allies, where whispers of corruption could erase her completely. Her pulse quickened, breath shallow as she leaned toward her assigned public defender, a nervous young man named Peter Langley. Peter was only 26, with hair that refused to stay combed and round glasses that made him look perpetually overwhelmed. He had graduated law school 2 years prior and had been thrown into the grinder of low-paying cases no one else wanted. His shirts were always slightly wrinkled, and he carried a constant smell of library dust and cheap coffee. Despite his timid nature, Peter had a good heart, though fear often paralyzed his arguments. When Grace whispered, "If I leave this town, I won't come back," Peter's Adam's apple bobbed as he muttered, I'll try, but Judge Caldwell listens to Maddox." The gavel cracked. Caldwell announced, "Motion for immediate transfer is under review. Hearing adjourned until noon." Maddox gave a thin smile, satisfied. He didn't need to rush. The walls were already closing in. Meanwhile, across town, June's phone buzzed violently on the kitchen table of her seaside home. Ethan Park's message blinked on screen. "Check your inbox. You'll want to see this." June, still in her faded navy sweatshirt, opened the file. Her breath caught. The CCTV footage was grainy, filmed from the corner of a gas station where rain streaks distorted the lens. But even through the static haze, the figure of Kyle Dent was unmistakable. He leaned toward the back of Grace's sedan, gloved hands slipping inside his jacket, then into the trunk. The timestamp matched the night of Grace's arrest. The image froze on Dent's face, illuminated by lightning, a guilty man caught mid-act. June's chest tightened, both from triumph and fear. This was the proof they needed, undeniable and raw. She forwarded it instantly to Marion Hale, who was already waiting in her car outside the courthouse, camera bag beside her. Marion's lips curled into something between a grimace and a smile as she opened the file on her laptop. "Well, Dent," she muttered, "you're done." Maggie Doyle, the lighthouse widow, joined them soon after, wrapped in her heavy cardigan, hair smelling faintly of sea air. She carried a thermos of tea and a small notebook filled with her meticulous handwriting. Maggie had spent the morning at the docks, eavesdropping on fishermen who spoke of strange night deliveries. She placed her notes on the dashboard, her gnarled hands steady. They know the transfer's happening. Men at the dock said Maddox is boasting. If Grace leaves Harbor Point, she's lost. Atlas, sitting in his back seat, shifted, his ears pricking at Maggie's voice. He whined softly, pressing his nose to the window as if sensing Grace's desperation through concrete walls. His scarred flank rose and fell with steady breaths, but his eyes burned with alertness. June clenched the steering wheel, her knuckles whitening. Then we don't let her leave. Inside the courthouse, Maddox strode through the hallway, stopping briefly to speak to Lieutenant Harris, who stood tall with the stiff composure of a career officer. Harris was in his early 50s, with thinning blonde hair slicked back and a deep crease between his brows that never softened. To outsiders, he looked dependable, the sort of man who exuded reliability. To those who knew him, he was Maddox's right hand, his loyalty cemented by years of shared secrets. Maddox whispered something low and Harris gave a curt nod before walking away, boots echoing on the marble floor. Back at the seaside house, Ethan joined June and Marion via video call. His cluttered apartment loomed behind him, walls covered in sticky notes, wires spilling across the desk. He looked sleep-deprived but electric with focus. "The footage is solid," he said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "It's on 3 separate servers now. Maddox can't erase it unless he burns down the whole damn internet." Marion leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Good. But one video isn't enough. Caldwell will demand corroboration. We need chain of custody, timestamps, something linking Dent to the department's system. Ethan, can you pull station logs?" Ethan cracked a grin. "Already on it." He tapped his keyboard, windows flickering across his screen. "If Dent checked out evidence or clocked in during that stop, it's logged somewhere." June looked at Maggie, who was sipping her tea. "And you?" Maggie shrugged. "I'll testify if I have to. I'm old enough not to care who I anger anymore. They've already taken everything from me. They won't take my voice." The group fell silent for a moment, the gravity of the fight settling over them. Atlas whined again, breaking the stillness, his head resting on June's lap. She stroked his ear, whispering, "We're not done, boy. Not yet." Back in her cell, Grace sat across from Ruth Ann Carter, who had become her unlikely confidant. Ruth Ann, her braid messy and her eyes tired, leaned close. "They're moving you, aren't they?" Grace nodded. "Maddox wants me gone before I can fight." Ruth Ann's lips pressed thin. "Then you better hope the people out there are louder than the lies in here." For Grace, hope had become a fragile thing. But somewhere in the distance, perhaps carried on the salty breeze sneaking through the barred window, she thought she could hear Atlas's bark echoing faintly. She closed her eyes, holding on to the sound like a lifeline. The noon light cut through the tall windows of the Harbor Point courthouse, beams of pale gold settling on the worn oak benches. The air was thick with murmurs, reporters cramming into the back rows, townsfolk pressed shoulder to shoulder. Some came out of curiosity, others out of loyalty to Grace Whitaker, whose fate now balanced on a razor's edge. The tension seemed alive, crackling with each tick of the brass clock above the bench. Grace stood at the defense table, wrists trembling inside her shackles, though her eyes burned steady. She wore the same ill-fitting jumpsuit, its orange fabric faded from too many washes, but she no longer looked like a prisoner resigned to vanishing. Today, her voice had to become her weapon. At her side, Peter Langley fidgeted with his papers, sweat gathering beneath his collar, his glasses sliding down his nose. He whispered, "Stay calm. Just tell the truth." Grace gave him the faintest nod. Judge Evelyn Caldwell, stern as ever in her black robe, adjusted her glasses and looked down at the crowded courtroom. "This is an emergency hearing. Order will be maintained." Her voice cut sharp through the noise, quieting the gallery. Maddox entered with a swagger, his uniform crisp, medals gleaming under the lights. His hair was slicked neatly back, his jaw tight with disdain. He walked with the air of a man certain the system was built for him, every corridor a hallway of favors. He slid into his seat, flanked by Lieutenant Harris, whose thin smile carried no warmth. Grace stepped forward when prompted, her chains rattling. Her voice shook at first, but then steadied like a flame refusing to be extinguished. "I am not guilty of the charges against me, and today the truth has to be heard." Her words hung in the air, daring the room to disbelieve her. At that moment, Marion Hale rose from the gallery. She was tall, slender but wiry, her long auburn hair tied back in a no-nonsense knot, freckles visible even beneath the harsh lights. She had the posture of someone who had been underestimated too many times in her career and built armor out of stubbornness. Carrying her laptop, she approached the clerk's table. "Your Honor, if I may, I have evidence the court must see." Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "You are not counsel." Marion held her ground. "No, but I am a journalist with authenticated footage that exonerates the defendant." After a tense pause, Caldwell gestured. "Proceed." The screen flickered as Marion connected her device. The CCTV video played the grainy image of Kyle Dent slipping his gloved hand into Grace's trunk. Gasps rippled through the crowd, some leaning forward, others covering their mouths. From the defense bench, Ethan Park's voice emerged through a speakerphone, patched in live. His tone was clipped but electric, every syllable pulsing with suppressed outrage. "That footage matches the time of the traffic stop. And here is something else." Another file appeared, a dashcam video Ethan had painstakingly restored. The sound of rain against the windshield, the flash of headlights, Dent's voice murmuring, "It's planted. She won't know." The courtroom erupted into whispers, some shouting, "Shame!" Judge Caldwell hammered her gavel. "Order!" Maggie Doyle, wrapped in her sea-gray cardigan, shuffled forward next. She wasn't tall, her frame slight and her movements slow, but her voice carried the steadiness of the tides. "I've lived by that lighthouse 40 years. I saw their ship docking past midnight, men unloading crates no one was supposed to see. They want her gone because she knows too much." Her eyes fixed on Maddox with an unwavering glare, one sharpened by a lifetime of loss. As the crowd buzzed, Peter nervously cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we also submit one final piece." His hands trembled as he held up an old brass pocket watch, the chain tarnished but intact. This belonged to Grace's father. Inside, there is a recording. He opened the casing, a small device inside blinking faintly, and pressed play. The courtroom fell silent as a voice crackled through the static. It was Grace's father, Samuel Whitaker, his deep timbre weary but firm. "Maddox, you don't own me. If you push this deal, I'll speak. The people deserve the truth." Then another voice, colder, sharper, Maddox's unmistakable baritone. "Speak and you'll hang yourself. You think anyone will believe you once you're gone? Better a clean end than the mess I can make of you." The final click echoed like a gunshot. Grace closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, not of weakness, but of vindication. Her father had not taken his own life. He had been cornered. The audience roared. Some stood, shouting accusations. Reporters scrambled to capture every second. Judge Caldwell's face paled, her gavel striking furiously. Maddox rose to his feet, his composure cracked, face flushed crimson. "This is a fabrication. Lies!" His voice boomed, but the panic beneath it was unmistakable. Then another voice pierced the chaos. From the prosecution's table stood Assistant U.S. Attorney Nathan Cole, a man in his early 40s with broad shoulders and a weathered face that carried the permanent squint of someone used to reading men's truths in depositions and crime scenes. His sandy hair was cropped short, his tie neat, but his presence commanded without theatrics. Known for his calm but ruthless pursuit of corruption cases, Cole had built his reputation exposing officers who thought themselves untouchable. He spoke evenly, his tone cutting sharper than Maddox's fury. "Captain Maddox, based on the presented evidence, this court has no choice but to consider you a suspect. You are ordered into custody pending further investigation." His voice carried like a blade, clean and final. Two federal marshals, broad men in dark suits, moved down the aisle. Maddox's bravado splintered into raw desperation. "You can't do this. I built this town's safety. I am Harbor Point." His voice cracked as the marshals clasped his wrists in iron cuffs. The clink rang through the chamber, heavy as judgment. The gallery thundered with shouts, some cheering, others in disbelief. Judge Caldwell, visibly shaken, called for silence again, her gavel striking wood until splinters threatened. Through it all, Grace stood taller than she had in weeks. Though still bound, she felt the invisible chains around her chest loosen. She turned toward Marion, Maggie, and even the trembling Peter, her voice low but steady. "He can't bury us anymore." Atlas, waiting with June just outside the heavy wooden doors, barked sharply, as though sensing the shift in the air. The sound carried faintly into the courtroom, punctuating the moment like a drumbeat of freedom. The night came heavy over Harbor Point, the kind that pressed the ocean air thick against the lungs and blurred the edges of the docks with fog. Warehouse 14 stood at the end of a rusting pier, its corrugated metal walls streaked with salt stains, its windows blackened with grime. It had long been rumored to house smuggled goods and darker things, but no one in town had ever dared step inside. Tonight, it would finally be opened, not by rumor, but by force. Black SUVs rolled in without headlights, their engines whispering as they coasted to a stop. Federal agents in dark tactical gear spilled out, rifles slung tight across their chests, helmets matte against the misty light. Leading them was Deputy Caleb Hayes, his broad shoulders stiff inside his winter jacket, badge gleaming under the pier lamps. His square jaw was tense, eyes sharp, scanning every shadow as though the dark itself could strike back. Caleb's reputation in Harbor Point was split between respect and fear. He was a man who never bent. Not for bribes, not for intimidation. The kind of lawman who made enemies by standing too tall. At his side padded Atlas, the German shepherd whose black and tan coat glistened with the moisture of the fog. At 10 years old, Atlas carried scars along his flank and a faint limp in his right hind leg from an old injury, but his eyes were blazing amber, unyielding. Tonight, he wore his canine vest, snug across his lean body, a patch reading Police K9 reflecting faintly in the dock lights. He sniffed the air, ears pricked. Caleb murmured, "Easy, boy. We go on your signal." Inside the van parked nearby, Marion Hale adjusted her camera equipment. She had insisted on being embedded, and though the agents had resisted, her tenacity had worn them down. Her face was pale in the glow of her monitor, freckles like constellations scattered across her cheeks. Her jaw was tight with nerves, but her eyes, those sharp green eyes, were locked with a journalist's hunger. She had promised herself long ago never to run from the truth, no matter how sharp its teeth. "Move," whispered Agent Ramirez, the team leader, a compact man in his mid-30s with a shaven head and a scar cutting across his left eyebrow. His voice carried authority honed from years in narcotics stings. "Entry, 2 points. Hayes, you and your dog take the side door. We'll breach the main." Ramirez's calm belied his past. He had once lost a brother to a cartel ambush, and since then, every raid was personal, though he carried the grief like a stone hidden in his chest. The agent stacked against the front door. Caleb crouched low with Atlas at the warehouse's side, the dog's muscles taut as a bowstring. Then Atlas froze, nose lifted. A deep bark erupted from his throat, sharp, commanding, echoing across the dock. "Go!" Caleb shouted. The breaching charges cracked. Doors slammed open with thunder. Shouts of federal agents on the ground filled the cavernous interior. The stench of brine, mildew, and diesel clung to everything. Under flickering overhead lights, stacks of crates loomed high, and in the center of the concrete floor, duffel bags sat half-zipped, greenbacks spilling like weeds from their seams. A steel filing cabinet, door ajar, revealed binders stamped with the false charity logo, Seafarers Fund. Pages fluttered across the damp floor, names, dates, fabricated charges, an entire archive of Harbor Point's betrayals. Atlas barreled through the side entrance, his claws scraping the wet cement. His bark split the air again, a warning shot of flesh and fury. In that instant, a figure broke from behind a stack of barrels Kyle Dent. His thin frame jerked as he ran, his gaunt face twisted with panic. The man's greasy blonde hair clung to his temples with sweat, and his pale eyes darted wild, like a cornered rat. He clutched a pistol in one shaking hand, the other dragging a duffel of money that slowed him down. "Dent!" Caleb roared, voice echoing. "Drop it!" But Dent bolted for the rear exit. Atlas lunged before Caleb even gave the order. The shepherd's body was a missile, muscle and loyalty honed to precision. He hit Dent mid-stride, the gun clattering across the floor as Dent crashed into a shallow pool of seawater that had seeped through a crack in the foundation. The stench of salt and rot filled his mouth as Atlas bore down, teeth flashing but stopping short of flesh. Instead, his weight pinned Dent, paws pressing him into the water. Dent thrashed, coughing, but the shepherd growled low, unrelenting, until Caleb snapped the cuffs on with a metallic click that rang like judgment. Meanwhile, the front team swept deeper into the warehouse. Ramirez shouted, "Clear left! Clear right!" Agents dragged duffels into the open, tore open crates lined with hidden compartments. One revealed unmarked bottles of opioids, another sealed packages of cash. In the shadows near the loading bay, 2 men tried to slip out. One was thick-set with tattoos curling up his neck, the other thin and twitchy. Both carried crowbars. They didn't make it far. 3 agents tackled them, the fight brief and brutal. At the dock outside, headlights pierced the fog. Another vehicle skidded to a halt, Maddox himself flanked by two loyal enforcers. His pristine uniform was gone, replaced by a dark leather coat. His face, once confident and proud, now glistened with desperation. He barked orders, "Load the boat! Get it out now!" His voice cracked under the weight of unraveling power. But Harbor Point wasn't asleep anymore. Dozens of townsfolk had gathered at the edge of the pier, drawn by the commotion. Some held phones aloft, filming. Others shouted curses. For years, Maddox had strutted as their protector, their captain, but tonight his mask had shattered. As federal marshals closed in, Maddox tried to push through the crowd, only to be shoved back by a fisherman with weather-beaten hands. "You sold us out, Maddox," the man spat. "No more." Pinned between his enforcers' panic and the town's rage, Maddox swung once, a futile gesture of defiance. But then the cuffs snapped around his wrists, harsh and final. His face, pale and twisted, was splashed across every phone camera in the crowd. The myth of Harbor Point's protector crumbled in real time. Inside, Caleb hauled Dent to his feet, water dripping from the man's soaked clothes. Dent sneered despite the cuffs biting into his wrists. "You think this changes anything? You've only pulled one thread. You don't know what's coming." His voice was bitter, cracked, but a faint grin lingered, like a man who believed in storms still gathering. Caleb shoved him forward. "Save it for the judge." Atlas shook water from his coat, amber eyes locked on Dent as if he understood the weight of the moment. Marion's camera caught it all, the shepherd standing tall beside his handler, the duffels of dirty money, the fallen captain dragged away in disgrace. For the first time, the corruption of Harbor Point had a face and a reckoning. The courthouse in Harbor Point had never felt so alive. Built a century ago of gray stone and white pillars, it loomed like a relic of a sterner age. Yet on this morning, sunlight painted its steps gold, breaking through weeks of storm and fog. A crowd gathered at the base of the steps, fishermen in weathered jackets, shopkeepers with aprons still tied, children clutching parents' hands. They weren't here out of duty, but out of a hunger to see something they thought they'd never witness. Justice unshackled from the shadows. Inside, the wooden benches of the courtroom were packed tight, the air humming with tension. At the defense table sat Grace Holloway, the woman whose name had once been dragged through mud by whispers and falsified reports. Grace was in her mid-30s, with chestnut hair pulled neatly back and a posture that trembled between exhaustion and defiance. Months of unjust accusation had hollowed her cheeks, but her hazel eyes burned with something unbroken. Today, for the first time in years, she wore a modest navy dress instead of prison khaki, and when she folded her hands on the table, they did not shake. Judge Eleanor Price presided, a woman of late 50s, compact and sharp-eyed, with short silver hair cut to the jawline. She was known as a letter-of-the-law type, feared for her impatience with theatrics, but respected even by those she ruled against. Once, years ago, she had been passed over for a federal appointment in favor of a political appointee, a slight that left her wary of power's corruption. That memory carved into her the resolve to guard her bench like sacred ground. The prosecution laid out the findings. Falsified evidence tied to Dent, corruption bleeding from Maddox's office, and funds funneled through the Seafarers Fund. Each exhibit was held aloft like a blade, slicing through the fog of lies that had once suffocated the town. Grace's attorney, Howard Keene, a wiry man in his 40s with sandy hair and narrow spectacles, stood with an air of restrained fury. Once dismissed as an eccentric idealist, he had stayed on Grace's case when every other lawyer told her to take a plea. His persistence was not only professional, it was personal. Howard's father had been jailed wrongfully in a similar scheme decades earlier, a stain that drove him to seek redemption in every client cast aside by the system. Finally, Judge Price's gavel struck. Her words were steady, each syllable weighted. "This court rules in favor of the defense. The conviction is hereby vacated with prejudice. Ms. Grace Holloway is fully exonerated and cannot be retried on these charges." The sound of wood against wood cracked through the chamber, and for a heartbeat the world was silent, like a held breath. Then came the release, the applause, the sobs, the sheer relief that spilled from benches and echoed off marble walls. Grace's head bowed into her hands. When she lifted it, tears streaked her face, but she was smiling through them. Outside, the news spread like a tide. Reporters scribbled furiously. Children waved homemade signs reading, "Truth wins and justice for Grace." Marion Hale's camera flashed among them, capturing the moment with quiet reverence. Her lips curved in the first smile Harbor Point had seen from her in weeks. The fallout came swiftly. Maddox and Dent, pale and hollow-eyed, were transferred under heavy guard to federal custody. Maddox's hair, once perfectly combed, now hung limp, his leather coat replaced with orange scrubs. Dent, wrists shackled, hissed curses at the cameras. But his words carried no weight anymore. Charges of conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering stacked against them like stones on a grave. For the first time, the men who once lorded power over Harbor Point were stripped to nothing more than defendants in a chain. The town didn't just cheer, it acted. Within weeks, a civilian oversight committee was formed, composed of shop owners, school teachers, and retired veterans. At its head was Maggie Turner, once dismissed as a stubborn activist. Maggie was in her early 40s with wiry auburn hair and a frame hardened by years of hard work at the docks. She carried herself with a no-nonsense stride, yet her voice, though gravelly, softened when she spoke to neighbors. She had lost a brother years back to an unjust charge, and that scar fueled her relentless push for reform. Under her coordination, every officer in Harbor Point would wear a body camera, and every complaint would be reviewed by civilians, not just officers protecting their own. Among those restored was Ruth Ann Wallace, a woman in her 50s with a kind face lined by years of caretaking. Her dark hair, streaked with silver, was usually tied into a bun beneath her nurse's cap. Once accused of negligence in a rigged report, Ruth Ann had lived years in quiet humiliation, her patients whispering, her license almost stripped. Now, as her name was cleared, she returned to the clinic, her smile tired but luminous. Children hugged her legs as she resumed her rounds, and for each patient she touched, Harbor Point remembered what compassion looked like. And Atlas, oh, Atlas. The German Shepherd became more than a canine. At a public ceremony on the courthouse steps, the mayor, a balding man named Samuel Whitaker, handed him a large brass key tied with a ribbon, the key to the city. The dog sat tall, his coat gleaming in the winter light, tail wagging as the crowd roared. Atlas tilted his head, amber eyes blinking at the sound, unaware of the symbolism but content in the joy. Children crowded forward to pet him, their laughter the music of a town reborn. Soon after, Atlas was assigned a gentler duty, serving as a therapy dog in the courthouse, easing the fear of children called to testify and giving comfort to victims who had waited too long for justice. That evening, Harbor Point glowed under a dawn of its own. The lighthouse, long abandoned, had been relit by volunteers, its beams sweeping the harbor once more. Atlas lay stretched across its stone steps, his head heavy on his paws, eyelids drooping. The chill of the sea clung to the air, but a knitted wool blanket, hand-woven by Maggie, rested across his back. She crouched to adjust it, her hands lingering in quiet gratitude. Around them, gulls wheeled in lazy arcs, their cries carried soft and far on the wind. Atlas yawned, shifting in his sleep, but when Maggie whispered, "Rest easy, boy, you've earned it," his tail thumped once against the stone before he settled again. Above them, the sky blushed with pinks and oranges, the first clean sunrise Harbor Point had seen in years. It was not triumphant in thunder or fanfare, but gentle, as though justice had finally remembered this small corner of the world. And in that light, with Atlas guarding the shore even in slumber, the town knew, the tide had turned, and nothing would drag them back to the darkness. In the end, Harbor Point discovered that justice is not only written in the law, but carried in the hearts of those brave enough to stand for truth. Grace's freedom, Ruth Ann's restoration, Maggie's persistence, and Atlas's loyalty were more than coincidences. They were threads of a greater design. Many in town whispered it felt like a miracle, a reminder that God often works through ordinary people, even through a faithful dog, to shine his light in the darkest of nights. In our daily lives, we face storms that make us doubt whether truth will ever prevail. Yet this story reminds us, do not lose heart. Just as dawn broke over Harbor Point, God's grace can break into our lives when hope seems gone. Miracles are not always thunder and lightning. Sometimes they are quiet acts of courage, love, and faithfulness that change everything. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story of redemption, and may God bless every one of you watching. Type Amen in the comments if you believe that God's justice and mercy still work wonders in our world.